What if the transatlantic slave trade never existed? Imagine an Africa untouched by the centuries-long storm of the transatlantic slave trade. No ships crossing the Atlantic in chains, no kingdoms weakened by human capture, no cultures torn apart for profit. What kind of world would we live in today if that tragedy never existed? This is not just a what-if story. It's a journey through history, imagination, and possibility to explore how Africa and indeed the world might have evolved without the forced displacement of millions of her people. We'll travel back to the golden age of African kingdoms, where learning, trade, and power flourished. We'll imagine a continent that kept its people and its genius, building thriving cities, industries, and alliances. We'll ask how the world economy, global culture, and racial relations might look if the slave trade never took place. And we'll explore whether colonialism, conflict, or human greed might still have found another path. Together we'll move through 1. Africa before the slave trade. 2. The human cost that never happened. 3. Economic power of a free Africa. 4. A renaissance on African soil. 5. The world without the slave trade economy. 6. The absence of colonialism. 7. Global demographics and culture. 8. The moral and spiritual landscape of humanity. 9. The butterfly effect. What might still go wrong. 10. The Africa that could have been. And finally, our conclusion. What lessons we can draw from this alternate reality. Each part will take you deeper into a story that could have been. Not to rewrite history, but to remind us of what was lost and what can still be rebuilt. So stay with me till the end, because in this journey, every what if reveals a truth about who we are and who we might yet become. What if the transatlantic slave trade never existed? Before the first slave ships ever touched African shores, this continent was not a blank map waiting to be discovered. It was already alive with power, knowledge, and innovation. Africa before the slave trade was a tapestry of thriving civilizations. From the Mali Empire with its rivers of gold, to the intellectual heights of Songhai, to the intricate artistry of Benin and the spiritual strength of Congo, Africa was a continent of builders, thinkers, and rulers who commanded respect across oceans. Picture the grand city of Timbuktu, not the desert ruins so often imagined, but a beacon of learning where scholars debated astronomy, medicine, law, and philosophy. Its libraries housed thousands of manuscripts, the lifeblood of a civilization that prized wisdom as much as wealth. At Ife, bronze sculptors crafted faces so lifelike that centuries later, European archaeologists refused to believe Africans had made them. And in Axum, monumental obelisks reached skyward, symbols of an ancient Christian kingdom that traded with Arabia, India, and beyond. Across the continent, trade routes connected people and ideas, caravans moving salt, gold, spices, and textiles from the interior to the coasts. The Sahara Desert, far from being a barrier, was a highway of exchange linking West Africa to North Africa and the Middle East. And along the Indian Ocean, African merchants sailed dhows to Arabia, India, and China, bringing back porcelain, silk, and new knowledge of navigation. This was a world of cultural unity through diversity. Hundreds of languages, countless traditions, and yet a deep sense of shared humanity. Disputes were settled by council, trade was governed by trust, and art celebrated both of the living and the ancestors. So when we ask, what if the transatlantic slave trade never existed? This is the starting point. An Africa already rich, organized, and connected to the world. Not an empty land, but a continent with its own heartbeat. Had history unfolded differently, these civilizations would have continued to evolve, compete, and collaborate, shaping their own destiny, rather than having it rewritten by foreign hands. Africa stood tall before the storm. The tragedy of the slave trade was not the story's beginning. It was the interruption of a chapter that promised greatness. Human cost that never happened. Now, imagine if that storm never came. If no ships had ever anchored off the African coasts to trade in human lives. If no child had ever been torn from their mother's arms, no kingdom destabilized by raids, no villages emptied under the cover of night. The transatlantic slave trade stole more than just people. It stole potential. It ripped away scientists, farmers, blacksmiths, artists, mothers, and leaders, the very lifeblood of communities. But in our alternate world, all of them remain. Imagine tens of millions of lives still on African soil, generations living, growing, and contributing to their homelands. Villages expanding into towns, towns growing into cities, societies building layer upon layer of innovation. The population of Africa would have soared centuries earlier, creating stronger economies, more diverse communities, and richer cultures. Languages that disappeared might still be spoken today. Songs that died in silence would still echo through villages at dusk. Families that were scattered across 3 continents would still sit around the same fire, telling the same stories in the same tongue. Without the trauma of mass abduction, Africa's social structures would have evolved steadily, with communities refining systems of leadership, trade, and education, rather than struggling to recover from repeated devastation. The cycle of distrust that the slave trade created between kingdoms, fueled by European weapons and greed, would never have taken root. Instead of fear and suspicion, trade and cooperation could have flourished. Instead of cultural loss, there would be continuity. Ancestors remembered not as victims, but as inventors, scholars, and visionaries. And beyond the borders of Africa, the world itself would look different. Because when you remove the forced migration of millions of people, you change the very DNA of global history. The population of Europe, the Americas, and even Asia would have evolved along new, unexpected lines. In this alternate reality, the human story would be whole, not fractured. The spiritual and cultural wounds that still echo through centuries would never have been inflicted. Instead, Africa's people would have lived, thrived, and expanded together with their dignity and destiny intact. Imagine a world where Africa's wealth, its gold, its ivory, its salt, and its fertile lands was used not to enrich foreign empires, but to build African power. In this timeline, no slave ships arrived to drain human labor and strength. Instead, African trade continues to evolve naturally, partnerships stretching from West Africa to Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Merchants from Mali and Benin trade directly with explorers from Portugal and merchants from India, not as captives or suppliers of slaves, but as equals, exchanging goods, ideas, and innovations. With populations intact, African kingdoms have the workforce to cultivate vast farmlands, mine their own gold, and refine it into coins and jewelry. Artisans perfect bronze casting, textile weaving, and blacksmithing, not to serve foreign masters, but to supply growing African markets and trade routes. Picture thriving ports like Lagos, Mombasa, or Luanda, transformed into global commercial hubs, with African fleets sailing the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. African traders formed their own shipping companies centuries early, sending palm oil, spices, and precious minerals abroad, returning with technology, tools, and learning that fuel further growth. In this world, African industrialization begins early, not in the shadow of colonization, but in partnership with other continents. By the 18th century, cities like Timbuktu, Kano, Great Zimbabwe, and Kilwa could rival London or Lisbon, centers of innovation powered by local industries and international trade. Without the bleeding of resources and people, the continent's wealth circulates within Africa. Banks and trade guilds emerge, supporting agriculture, mining, and manufacturing. African engineers design irrigation systems, architects build grand stone cities, and educators establish schools that blend local wisdom with global knowledge. Instead of European factories built on slave profits, we might have seen African-led industries rising, turning raw materials into finished products exported worldwide. Africa becomes not a supplier of labor, but a competitor in the global economy. And imagine the balance of power. Europe's wealth grows slower without enslaved labor. Colonial expansion faces stronger African resistance, not with swords alone, but with economic independence and political unity. Trade treaties replace coercion. Diplomacy replaces conquest. A world where Africa stands shoulder to shoulder with Europe and Asia, not beneath them. This is the Africa that could have emerged, powerful, prosperous, and respected. An Africa not defined by extraction, but by exchange. A continent that builds, trades, and leads on its own terms. What happens when a people's spirit is never broken? When generations of artists, scholars, and inventors are never stolen away, but stay to build, create, and imagine? Welcome to the African Renaissance that might have been. Without the scars of slavery, Africa's great centers of knowledge, Timbuktu, Ife, Axum, Alexandria, continue to thrive as global universities. Students from around the world travel to learn astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and law from African scholars. Imagine lecture halls echoing with debates about science and justice, long before Oxford or Harvard reached their peaks. In this alternate world, the torch of human progress burns brightly on African soil. Mathematicians in Mali develop new theories of numbers. Physicians in Axum perfect herbal and surgical medicine centuries ahead of their time. Architects in Benin and Great Zimbabwe design massive stone cities with advanced drainage, energy-efficient layouts, and towering monuments celebrating unity, not conquest. African art flourishes, not locked in museums overseas, but proudly displayed in thriving cities across the continent. Sculptors, painters, and poets create a cultural revolution, one rooted in identity, spirituality, and progress. Their works inspire the world, influencing art in Asia and Europe through trade and collaboration, not colonization. Music, too, evolves differently. Rhythms from the Sahara, the Congo, and the Cape spread through trade routes, fusing with Arabic melodies and Asian harmonies to create a truly global sound, born not of exile, but of connection. Imagine a world where the African drum becomes as revered as the European violin, where global music carries African heartbeats as its foundation. Science and technology would not be far behind. Freed from centuries of disruption, African inventors and thinkers could contribute early to discoveries in navigation, metallurgy, agriculture, and even astronomy. The Dogon people's knowledge of the stars, for instance, would grow into an African-led field of space study, perhaps leading to the continent's own observatories centuries before modern telescopes. Philosophers developed the Ubuntu doctrine, a worldview that shapes global ethics around unity, humanity, and balance. This moral framework influences politics and law worldwide, reshaping how nations view justice and equality. Imagine cities like Lagos, Addis Ababa, and Mombasa, not colonial outposts, but shining metropolises of innovation, culture, and learning, where libraries hold manuscripts in Swahili, Amharic, Arabic, and Yoruba, and where Africa's children grow up knowing that their ancestors' brilliance never dimmed. This would have been Africa's true renaissance, born not from Europe's shadows, but from Africa's own light, a continent that leads the world not through power, but through wisdom. Because when knowledge and freedom grow side by side, civilization flourishes. And in this world without chains, Africa would have led humanity into a golden age of creativity and enlightenment. What if the world's greatest economies had not been built on human suffering? What if the foundation of modern wealth, the slave trade, never existed? Let's step into that world. Without the Transatlantic Slave Trade, the Americas would look entirely different. The sugar plantations of the Caribbean, the cotton fields of the American South, and the coffee estates of Brazil all depended on enslaved African labor. In their absence, those economies would have had to rely on smaller-scale farming, fair wages, and technological innovation much earlier. Perhaps the Americas would have grown more slowly, but more justly. Instead of nations rising on exploitation, they might have been built on cooperation, invention, and partnership. The wealth that fueled Europe's Industrial Revolution, profits from sugar, cotton, tobacco, and gold mined by enslaved hands, would never have existed in the same form. Europe's rapid industrial growth would have been delayed. Without the immense capital gained from slavery and colonial trade, factories, banks, and empires might have risen at a slower, more sustainable pace. The balance of power in the world could have shifted, allowing Africa, Asia, and the Americas to develop side by side. The absence of slavery also means the absence of the racial caste system that shaped modern societies. No ideology of white superiority, no centuries of systemic racism. Without the need to justify human bondage, European philosophy and religion might have evolved toward equality much earlier. Imagine America, a land of many nations where indigenous peoples still hold vast territories and cultures thrive undisturbed. Imagine Brazil, not defined by plantations and suffering, but by native civilizations blending peacefully with immigrant traders from Africa, Asia, and Europe. The Caribbean, not an archipelago of colonial sugar islands, but a crossroads of free cultures exchanging art, language, and ideas. And because Africa's children never left in chains, the African diaspora would not be scattered across the globe. Instead of jazz being born in New Orleans or samba in Brazil, those rhythms might have emerged in Lagos, Accra, or Dakar, carried across oceans by trade, not by tears. The economic order of the world would have been rewritten. We might have seen multiple centers of global power, not one dominated by Europe and its colonies. Technology and progress could have followed different paths, slower perhaps, but more humane and balanced. A world where no one is born into chains, where the wealth of nations is measured not by what they took, but by what they built together. In this reality, history would not echo with the cries of the enslaved, but with the songs of free people building a shared destiny. If the transatlantic slave trade never happened, then one of history's darkest shadows, colonialism, might never have followed. Because slavery was not just an atrocity, it was the gateway to empire. It was through the trade in human beings that Europe learned Africa's geography, its wealth, and its internal divisions. Once the trade ended, colonization began, justified by the same greed and the same lies of superiority. But in a world where that trade never existed, would Europe have had the same path to domination? Without centuries of profit from enslaved labor, Europe's power would have been smaller, its fleets fewer, its armies weaker, its ambitions limited. Africa, meanwhile, would have remained strong, unified through trade networks, kingdoms, and cultural alliances that grew without interruption. Instead of foreign empires carving the continent like a feast, imagine a sovereign Africa, negotiating trade and diplomacy as an equal. Benin trading bronze art with Italy, Mali exchanging scholars with Persia, Congo forming maritime alliances with Portugal, not as servants, but as partners. And within the continent, the seeds of unity might have grown earlier. The Hausa, Zulu, Ashanti, and Swahili states could have formed a Pan-African confederation, a network of allied nations bound by commerce, shared defense, and mutual respect. Think of it, from Cape to Cairo, a corridor of cooperation, roads linking empires, trade routes guarded by collective security, and an African parliament centuries before the idea appeared in Europe. Would conflict still exist? Certainly. No society is free from ambition or rivalry. But without the external pressures of colonization, Africa's internal disputes would have been African problems with African solutions, not excuses for invasion. Europe might still have sought Africa's resources, but instead of conquest, it would have come through treaty and negotiation. No scramble for Africa, no Berlin Conference, no artificial borders that tore families and tribes apart. Imagine the ripple effect. Egypt and Ethiopia leading trade across the Red Sea. The Great Lakes region becoming a manufacturing hub. Coastal West Africa rivaling Venice and Lisbon as global centers of wealth. By the 19th century, Africa could have stood shoulder to shoulder with Europe, Asia, and the Americas, not as colonies, but as collaborators. And perhaps, in this alternate world, the term Third World would never exist, because the world would never have been divided into firsts and thirds at all, only different nations sharing the same human story. A free Africa, an unbroken world, a history rewritten not by conquest, but by connection. Every action in history ripples outward, shaping not just nations, but people, languages, and identity itself. So, what happens to the world's demographics and culture if the transatlantic slave trade never existed? First, the most striking difference, there would be no African diaspora in the Americas. No millions taken from West and Central Africa to the Caribbean, Brazil, or the United States. No forced blending of African, European, and indigenous cultures under the weight of slavery. But that doesn't mean a lack of connection. It means those cultural exchanges would happen through trade, travel, and choice, not change. Imagine a world where Africa's people still travel the world, not as captives, but as merchants, scholars, and explorers. African traders settling in South America, blending Yoruba or Igbo traditions with local cultures, willingly and proudly. African sailors in Asia sharing cuisine, music, and art with Indian and Chinese merchants, not as slaves, but as equals. The cultural footprint of Africa would still circle the globe, but it would be a mark of influence, not of pain. Now think of music. Without the slave trade, there would be no jazz, blues, reggae, or hip-hop as we know them. because those were born from struggle, from survival. But perhaps their energy, rhythm, and storytelling would have blossomed on African soil instead. Imagine Timbuktu as the world's musical capital, where instruments like the kora and talking drum evolved into new sounds that influenced global music centuries earlier. Instead of jazz emerging from New Orleans, it could rise from Lagos or Dakar, spreading across the oceans through radio and trade. Instead of reggae being born in Jamaica, it might come from coastal Ghana, carrying messages of unity, spirituality, and resistance that inspired the entire world. Africa's languages and cuisines would have traveled naturally too, Swahili words blending with Arabic and Hindi through trade. West African dishes like jollof rice, yams, and spices becoming global favorites long before colonization ever began. And because Africans would have remained to their homeland, their identity would never have been fractured. No generational trauma of separation, no desperate search to rediscover roots centuries later. The global African community would have been a network, vibrant, confident, and united. But beyond Africa, the world would look different too. In the Americas, indigenous cultures would have flourished longer, unshaken by the demographic transformation slavery brought. In Europe, societies might have developed a more global outlook earlier, built on trade and respect, not hierarchy and race. Because the idea of race itself as we know it was shaped by the need to justify slavery. Without it, humanity might have seen itself not in terms of color, but in terms of culture and contribution. Music swells. Visuals show people of every continent trading, dancing, and celebrating, with Africa's rhythms at the center. In this world, Africa is not a forgotten origin. It's a beating heart. Its people shape global identity, not through exile, but through presence. The world's story becomes one of cultural exchange, not displacement. A world richer, fairer, and far more united in its diversity. Moral and spiritual landscape of humanity. History doesn't just shape borders and economies, it shapes the very soul of humanity. So if the transatlantic slave trade never existed, how different would our collective conscience be? Without slavery, Europe's moral and spiritual journey would have followed another path. For centuries, philosophers, priests, and kings had to twist faith and reason to justify the unjustifiable. They built entire systems to claim that one race was destined to serve another, that domination was divine. But without the need to defend human bondage, those lies would never take root. The world's religions might have evolved with clearer moral integrity, grounded in equality, not supremacy. Christianity, Islam, and other faiths would have had no stain of complicity to erase, no centuries of silence to atone for. Perhaps the church's focus would have remained where it began, on compassion, justice, and human dignity, instead of being entangled in empire and exploitation. The Enlightenment, too, might have been truly enlightened. Thinkers like Locke, Hume, and Kant would have had no reason to define humanity through the lens of race, because no racial hierarchy would have existed to defend. Racial science, segregation, apartheid, Jim Crow, all of it would never have been conceived, because there would have been no foundation to build it on. In this alternate world, humanity might have confronted its moral evolution centuries earlier. Equality, brotherhood, and freedom could have been universal principles, not hard-won rights after generations of struggle. And what of Africa's own spiritual journey? Freed from the trauma of invasion and loss, African belief systems, rooted in respect for ancestors, nature, and balance, would have grown stronger, spreading wisdom across the world. The idea of Ubuntu, I am because we are, could have become a global philosophy, shaping politics, education, and human relations. Imagine nations built not just on power, but on shared humanity. Imagine global diplomacy driven by moral consciousness, where the value of a person is never weighed against profit. The arts, too, would have reflected this moral evolution. Literature, theater, and film exploring humanity's unity rather than its divisions. And the absence of racial trauma would have given the world a gentler soul, one where empathy is a reflex, not a hard lesson. The music deepens. A slow choir hums as scenes of people embracing, working, and praying together fill the screen. In this world, there would still be ambition, still be struggle, but not built on the suffering of another race. humanity's conscience would be cleaner, its spirit freer, its sense of justice deeper. Because when one crime of history is removed, the ripple of goodness touches everything, from how we see God to how we see each other. It's tempting to imagine a perfect world, a peaceful Africa, a fairer globe. But even in this alternate history, without the transatlantic slave trade, the story of humanity would still be complex. Because where there are people, there is ambition, rivalry, and the endless struggle for power. Even without European interference, Africa would still have faced its own internal challenges. Kingdoms rise and fall, sometimes from within. Empires like Mali or Songhai might have eventually clashed over trade routes, resources, or religion. Tribal rivalries, regional disputes, and leadership struggles could still have caused wars, though fought on African terms, not manipulated by foreign greed. Greed and competition, after all, are not unique to Europe. History shows that power, if unchecked, can corrupt anywhere. So perhaps Africa's great empires might have faced their own internal slave systems or social hierarchies, smaller in scale but still unjust. The question is not whether exploitation would exist, but what form it might take. Could rich kingdoms have dominated weaker neighbors? Might resource-rich regions, gold in Mali, copper in Congo, oil in Nigeria, have sparked internal competition and inequality? Could the unity of the continent have fractured under the weight of ambition? And what about the outside world? Even without slavery, global trade would still create temptation. Europe, Asia, and later the Americas would still hunger for Africa's wealth, gold, ivory, minerals, and land. Perhaps, if not through slavery, exploitation might have arrived later in another form. Economic control, political manipulation, or resource extraction disguised as partnership. It's also possible that technological imbalances would still emerge. If Europe advanced faster in weaponry or machinery, conflict might still have erupted, just under different pretexts. The motives of greed and domination might have found new doors to open, even if the old ones never existed. But here's the key difference. In this alternate timeline, Africa would have been ready. Its kingdoms educated, united, and self-reliant. Its people aware of the dangers of external influence, capable of negotiating from strength, not desperation. So while the world might still know war and corruption, it would not know the scale of dehumanization that slavery unleashed. The scars might still exist, but they'd be smaller, self-healing, and homegrown, not inflicted by centuries of foreign domination. Because even in a world without chains, humanity remains flawed but not broken. Conflict may still come, but so will wisdom. Mistakes may still be made, but so will progress. In this world, Africa's destiny is not perfect, but it is its own. A future determined by Africans, not dictated by outsiders. And that alone changes everything. Now, let's look at what could have been. Not just what was avoided, but what Africa might have become. Imagine an Africa never enslaved, never colonized, never broken apart. An Africa where the knowledge of Timbuktu, the art of Benin, the architecture of Axum, and the strength of Zulu all evolved together, uninterrupted. Cities rise where ancient kingdoms once stood. From the dunes of the Sahara to the valleys of the Congo, bustling metropolises hum with life. Skyscrapers inspired by traditional patterns pierce the skyline, while streets are alive with languages, color, and innovation. Cairo to Cape Town, connected by high-speed rail and shared purpose. Lagos to Nairobi, linked by trade, culture, and science. A continent united not by borders drawn in Berlin, but by vision, cooperation, and shared destiny. In this world, African scientists lead discoveries in medicine and renewable energy. African engineers pioneer clean technologies suited to their environment. Universities in Timbuktu and Addis Ababa attract global scholars eager to study in Africa, not extract from it. The continent's natural wealth fuels its people's prosperity, not foreign empires. Gold and diamonds fund education and research, not foreign banks. Oil, gas, and solar power light African homes before any are exported abroad. Art flourishes. The Benin bronzes are not hidden in Western museums. They stand proudly in grand halls of African capitals, next to new masterpieces by young African sculptors and painters. Music and film from Africa dominate global culture. Afrobeat, Swahili pop, and Amharic ballads leading charts worldwide. shaping a shared cultural identity. Politically, Africa is a confederation of strong nations, respecting diversity, bound by common values. Disputes are settled by dialogue, guided by the wisdom of elders and modern diplomacy alike. The vision of leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and Nelson Mandela is realized centuries earlier. A United States of Africa, where every citizen knows they belong to something vast, ancient, and powerful. Economically, the continent stands as a global equal, trading freely with Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Its ports bustle, its industries thrive, its youth innovate. The phrase, developing world, doesn't exist because development was never denied. And most importantly, its people walk with dignity. No one must reclaim an identity stolen by colonization. No one must rebuild what was destroyed by greed. Instead, generations grow up with pride in who they are, descendants of builders, not victims. The music grows triumphant. Children wave flags of different African nations that merge into one vast banner stretching across the map of the continent. This is the Africa that could have been, a continent of light, strength, and wisdom, not defined by suffering, but by success. Not remembered for its loss, but for its leadership. A vision not too late to chase, because though the past cannot change, the future still listens. So, what have we learned from this journey through imagination? What if the transatlantic slave trade, one of humanity's darkest chapters, had never existed? We've seen how Africa's kingdoms might have flourished, united by trade, intellect, and culture. We've imagined a world without racial hierarchies, a world where the Americas and Europe grew not on chains, but on cooperation, where art, music, and science blossomed freely, and the word race never divided humanity. We've seen how morality might have evolved earlier, how religion and reason could have stood side by side without contradiction, how equality could have been humanity's foundation, not its unfinished dream. And we've seen that even in a world without slavery, challenges would remain, for greed and ambition are part of the human story. But they would have been our struggles to face, not wounds inflicted from outside. Yet, as we look at this imagined world, one truth shines brighter than all. Though history cannot be rewritten, the future still can. We cannot undo the past. We cannot bring back the millions lost or erase the pain that shaped generations. But we can learn, we can remember, not to dwell, but to rebuild, to honor the strength that survived the chains, to reclaim what was stolen, dignity, unity, and vision. Africa's story is not just one of loss, but of endurance and rebirth. The same creativity, wisdom, and courage that built the Mali Empire, the Great Zimbabwe, and the Kingdom of Benin still lives in her people today. And that spirit, once awakened, can still shape the world. So as we close this chapter, remember, every chain broken in the past was a step toward the freedom we hold today. And every dream we pursue now brings us closer to the Africa and the world that could have been. Because though history cannot be rewritten, the future can. A world without chains, imagining Africa's alternate past. If this story moved you, share it, not just to remember what was lost, but to inspire what can still be built. Because Africa's greatest chapter may yet be unwritten.